So hi, everyone. For those of you I don't know, my name is Michael Goodhart. I'm director at the Global Studies Center and also a professor of political science. And I'll be conducting the workshop today along with my colleague, Dr. Kat Leader. Kat, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, everybody. I think my official name is the USIS Visiting Professor of Global Contemporary Issues.
Contemporary Global.
Contemporary Global Issues. I teach in the Global Studies Center, and this semester I'm teaching a really exciting course on walking in the global city. And I also am here to provide a secondary perspective on research.
Great. And Elaine, do you just want to introduce yourself in case there are people who don't know you?
Sure. Hi, I'm Elaine Lynn, and I'm the Assistant Director for Academic Affairs with the Global Studies Center, and I advise students in our Global Studies Certificate, Global Health Certificate, and with the BPhil. So nice to see all your faces.
Right. If you're interested in either of the certificates or in doing the BPhil, Elaine is the person that you will want to be and need to be in touch with, and she'll help you navigate all of the various paperwork and so on that's involved to make sure you meet the requirements, et cetera. So I'm glad everyone could make it today. I wish we could be in person, in part because we have a PowerPoint that we want to run through to make sure we talk you through the research process sort of from beginning to end in a comprehensive way. But among the problems with a PowerPoint on Zoom is that I can't also see your faces simultaneously. At least I can't when I'm stuck at home and don't have multiple computer monitors and whatever else. So please, if you have a question, use the raise hand function or pop something into the chat. There are built-in pauses, and there are lots of times when we'll pop out of the PowerPoint to chat with you about things that we're talking about. But if at any point along the way you have questions, just let us know. I mean, the whole point of this is to try to answer your questions and take some of the mystery and apprehension out of like taking on an independent research project. So, the more we can respond to your specific concerns, the better. And as Kat said, she and I will be able to provide complementary perspectives. I'm more trained as a social scientist. She's more trained in the humanities. Both of us do very interdisciplinary work. And so hopefully we'll be able to speak to a lot of your situations.
And I also work in the performing arts. So for those of you who maybe have interests in including some sort of creative component in your thesis, or some sort of anthropological human-based research component, those are the kinds of things that I've worked on.
Right. So we've sort of set this up in a way that that imagines that you're all intending to pursue the BPhil. Now, it doesn't have to be true for you to be here. I think everything we're going to talk about would apply to any kind of research project you might do, in a departmental honors class, or just if you want to take something on your own. But we've sort of organized it that way just to give it a kind of through line from beginning to end. So. I guess without further ado, let me start with the PowerPoint. Let's see. So, okay, we know that already. Come on. So here's the four main areas that we're going to cover today. We're going to talk about how you formulate a research question, including what a research question is, why you need one. We'll talk about the research process. We'll talk about writing it up, meaning writing up your research, writing the thesis itself, and then some issues to do with methods and ethics. So first question is, why do you want to do research? I mean, this is a question that's of interest to us, so we can, help you navigate this process. But also, it's a question that you should really start by asking yourself. So let me just throw it out to people. Why are you here? Why are you interested in doing research? What brought you here? Elin, go ahead.
Oh, because I know I want to go to graduate school and probably doing some work that's need research career-wise. So I would like to have this experience just in my pocket and start to gain the skills.
Okay, great. So grad school is on the radar. That's a good reason. How about other folks?
Yeah, grad school is honestly one of the best reasons to be interested in doing undergraduate research, because the more experience you have with it, the more you'll know if that's really the direction you want to go. Grace wants to incorporate a level of professionalism into her writing. Grace, can you define what you mean by professionalism?
Yeah, so for me, I want to be a journalist, and the kind of journalism I want to do will be research heavy, just because of the different topics and such that I want to be covering. And so when I am conveying the things that I am writing about, I want to be able to be as, I guess, I'm losing the words here, but just to be concise in a scientific way, and I'm not there yet. So I think this will be very helpful.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, especially for longer form journalism where you're doing some kind of, whether it's formally investigative reporting or whether you're just researching a longer story about any number of topics, many of the things we'll talk about here, I think will be relevant.
And even in shorter form journalism or any kind of writing, the ability to set yourself a goal and understand the scope of that goal, how big it is, and be able to put together a timeline and fulfill that goal is a set of skills that you will use regardless of what you do later in life.
Yeah, Abby.
What I think is really cool about research is that you can kind of, dive into a very specific interest that you have that maybe you otherwise wouldn't get to study a lot just in a class, or you can also like combine interests that you have from different fields.
Yeah, thank you for mentioning that. I think we don't often think of it this way, but research is really just an opportunity to learn more about things that we're curious about. And that's a theme we'll hit again and again.
And it is very true that finding exactly what you want to study often doesn't fit neatly into the boxes that academia tries to put it into. And we'll talk about this more, but my undergraduate thesis involved trying to put together theater and gender studies and South Asian studies. And I had no idea what I was doing, but really wanted something that touched on all three.
Yeah, and that's going to be a challenge for lots of you. If you're interested, at least in global studies, it's going to be that trick of combining a bunch of things that itself becomes part of the puzzle, right? And I know there's a number of you here who are interested in the BPhil program because I've spoken to you about it separately. So that's going to apply to you for sure. I've put what do you want to get out of doing research as a separate question. And that's partly to sort of make you think about the differences between your kind of, social scientists would call this intrinsic and extrinsic motivations, right? Like what drives you to do it? And then like, what do you hope are the things that will come of it? So some of those things we might just reformulate what you've already said, right? I'd like to be a better writer. I'd like to be prepared for graduate school. I'd like to get the BPhil degree. I don't know if people have other thoughts about this, but I just did want you to think a little bit about, doing research can be both a goal in itself, and an instrumental goal, something that you want to do because you have other goals or reasons as well.
I think it's a great opportunity just to fulfill my curiosity. Like, normally when we're taking class, we don't have a chance to go deeper into a certain topic that I'm interested, but this is a great opportunity for me to really dig deep into my own interests.
I don't know if this is anything that has come up for any of you, but for me, the first time that I really did a large scale research project, I had always felt deeply invested in the world and felt like when I was taking classes, often they didn't seem to connect to things outside of the university. And your research project is a great moment to start making those connections clear for yourself and for others, because in fact, a lot of the things that you're doing at Pitt do have relevance in the world around you, but we just don't necessarily talk about it in those terms.
So we've been talking about, why do you want to do research, but what really is research? This is a definition that I really like. Research is formalized curiosity. It's poking and prying with a purpose. So when you all think of doing research, what does that mean to you? Presumably it didn't mean poking and prying with a purpose until you read this quote. So what does it mean to you? Mika?
Yeah, I really like that definition too. And when I think of research, I think of it as approaching a question in like the most logical or organized way possible in order to come to a specific conclusion.
Oops. Sorry.
One of the things that I currently teach the capstone seminar in global studies. So if any of you are doing research in which you're in your third year now, I will be teaching you in the fall of this upcoming year. And one of the things that I emphasize a lot in terms of thinking about what research is, in the academic context, research also has to involve contributing something new or filling a gap in the existing literature on the topics that you're interested in. So part of it is curiosity, but part of it is also about finding a question that hasn't necessarily been answered as well as you would like it to.
Yeah, we'll talk some more in a couple of slides about different ways that one can sort of different contributions one can make with the academic side of research, for sure. How about others? Like, can you give some examples of research you've done in the past or things that maybe qualify as research? Let me ask you this. How's research, do you think, different from the work you do to write an essay for a class you might be taking? Corinne?
I feel like when you're writing a paper for a class, it's just the knowledge you're gaining is pre-existing, whereas research, you kind of create your own knowledge.
Okay. So difference between sort of tracking down knowledge that's already out there, being a consumer of knowledge, and sort of trying to generate some new knowledge. Yeah.
Jasmine says that research is a more engaging process. Do you want to say more about what you mean by engaging, Jasmine?
Sure. I just mean that when you're writing an essay, sure, you might be taking away from other people's research, like in document review or in scholarly articles. But when you're committing to your own research, you are having your own hands-on experiences, whether it's interviews or experimentation. So I feel that you are committing yourself more to the final project rather than just in an essay.
Yeah, I think there's more of a sense. What I'm sort of hearing you say is there's more of a sense of ownership of the project in a way, right? That you've got more of an investment personally in the work and the outcomes.
Someone else's hand was up and then it went down. Does that person want to say what they were going to say, or did it get covered?
Yeah, it was kind of covered. I kind of look at it as like taking from the existing body of work versus trying to contribute to that, or kind of like trying to expand or create new bodies of knowledge, but we kind of already discussed it.
So I think not every professor by any means agrees about what the difference is between what you do in your classes versus capital R research, because for me, the only real difference ideally should be scope. Like, I think you should be pursuing creativity and creating your own knowledge in your shorter papers for class. But this is an opportunity to pursue something with far more depth, intensity, and time than you will have in other situations.
So when we talk about research, we often talk about, and sorry, this is just really choppy, this PowerPoint today. We often talk about the importance of having a research question to guide what we're doing. So when we talk about a research question, what do you think we mean? I mean, on one level, there's an obvious answer, right?
We need a problem?
Yeah, a problem. Say more about that, Jennifer.
Yeah, I was thinking about that. You saw, or you can see something in your environment, in the society, and you need to see what are the causes or consequences of that. What is the problem in the society and what is the problem in the science?
Okay, so often it involves identifying a problem or a puzzle, right? And puzzles, I don't know if problems are a subspecies of puzzles or puzzles are a subspecies of problems, or I don't know how I think about that, but they're related, right? So a problem might be something really specific, like what can we do about health inequality in Pittsburgh, right? Healthcare outcomes and healthcare inequalities in Pittsburgh. A puzzle might also be historical or philosophical in nature. And so there can be a really wide variety of those kinds of problems. Yeah. What else is a research question, or what else should it do?
It should kind of like fulfill the knowledge gap based on previous research.
Okay, or yeah, it should at least it should relate your project to some gap or question, yeah.
So one of the ways that I learned to frame a research question is around the idea of what I call a burning question. So a research question isn't just solving a problem or addressing a puzzle. It should be something that deeply, deeply engages you, that you desperately want to answer this question. And part of the reason that I say that is because you're going to be spending a lot of time on it. And some of that time honestly feels like drudgery. It's not always going to be super interesting, though it can be. And so that research question should in some way really deeply inspire you and be something that you've always wanted to answer.
I think that's absolutely right, and we'll talk a little bit later about the actual process and what all is entailed. I think for me, when I think of what a good research question is, I think of it as providing a kind of roadmap or compass, right? It's going to help to orient my research project. And it's going to do that hopefully in a way that's clear, focused, concise, complex, and arguable. And I'll say those again: clear, focused, concise, complex, and arguable. Three of those are pretty straightforward, I think, in terms of what they mean. Let me talk a little about complex and arguable. When we talk about a research question being complex, I don't mean sort of needlessly complex in the bad sense of what we think of as like academic questions, right? Like just complex for the sake of being complex. But rather, when we talk about complex, we mean it's got to be something to which the answer isn't obvious, or to which in the investigation, the research process itself is going to turn up interesting and productive things. Almost any puzzle you'll find in the world is going to be complex if you approach it properly. So this is less a question of coming up with a complex question than understanding the complexity of the issue into which you're going to be doing research, right? So it's really about framing, and it's really about making sure that you're attentive to all the complexity of your question. A very common conversation that I have with BPhil students or prospective BPhil students is they'll say initially, I don't think I can write something that long. I think the Honors College guidelines recommend, several chapters. Often, a BPhil thesis is often 60 to 100 pages. In my experience, depends a lot on the subject matter and what you're doing. And students often say, I can't imagine that I would write that much. Like, what would I have to say? And then by the end, inevitably, their problem is, I can't keep it to that length, right? Like, I've got too much to say. There's more that I want to do. I can't fit everything in. And so to me, what that shows is that in the course of doing the research, they've come to appreciate and begin to explore the complexity of the questions in which they're really interested. So so it's just to say that complexity is a lot about just making sure that you've posed a question that's rich and challenging. And if you've done that, that'll all those other themselves. Second one I wanted to say a little bit more about is that a research question should be arguable. What is that? What do you think I mean by that? Why is that important?
You should be able to defend your research.
Okay, you should be able to defend your research. And so that's going to be a question of marshaling evidence and making good arguments and so on. What else?
That also means that building on the you should be able to defend it, that also means that you should be able to obtain evidence. So some types of research questions require perhaps years spent in a different country. So you have to think about what is the evidence you need to obtain and how will you do it.
What else about arguability do you think is important?
So there could be like different answers and different research done on the same question.
Yeah, that's right, Elon. A good research question should admit of multiple possible answers, right? Now, it may be that if you're doing empirical work, there's only one correct answer to your question. And your goal might be, in that case, to establish that the answer that you've come to is the correct one, right? In lots of the work that we're doing in global studies in particular, it's not obvious that there's a single answer or that there's a correct answer or what that single or correct answer might be. And so part of what you're, part of what makes a research question is that it's something to which, the answer isn't obvious or straightforward. So, at what temperature does water boil is not at this point a good research question, right? Because it's well established. We don't need to do anything. Now, you could write an interesting history of how people came to understand, right? And there was all kinds of experimentation and differences of, so you could do research on the question of like how people learned to measure temperature and how, why it was important to know that water was boiling and like all those kinds of things. But they all introduce immediately a dimension of interpretation, right? And the minute you get outside of, a couple of fields where, straightforward empirical research, pretty much in the natural sciences or mathematics is going to be what you're doing, you're entering the realm of interpretation, right? And so you want to formulate a question that has multiple prospective answers, and that'll help you shape the research. That'll sort of help you know who your interlocutors are. That'll help you to form the thing as you go.
And in super concrete terms, part of the way that you can check how that's going is that you should not be able to answer your research question in a sentence. Like it should be a paragraph or multiple paragraphs to answer the question. And that helps you kind of think about like, okay, is this complex enough? Does this have multifaceted responses?
Right. So a good research question is going to do all those 5 things. It's going to guide you. And you need it so that it will keep you on track, keep you focused, give you direction, and to keep you moving in the right direction. It helps you also to rule things out. So your research question helps you know what's relevant to your work and what should be left aside. So at some level, everything is connected to everything. So at some level, it's kind of impossible to ever stop writing if you want to try and write a comprehensive, you can't write a theory of everything. So a research question is going to help you know what topics should I be exploring? What data should I be gathering? What evidence should I be looking for? What kinds of arguments should I be engaging with? And what should I be leaving aside? And that often turns out to be really tricky because as you get into it, there's lots of side paths and tangents you can go off on, and keeping focused becomes a real challenge. And so always referring back to your research question will also help to keep you on the path of answering your question and not some others, and help you avoid writing that kind of all about sort of paper that sometimes people get into.
So I often refer to that as defining your scope or your boundaries. And that's a really important thing you need to do early in conceiving of your research question. But then you need to recognize that your scope and your boundaries are going to change as you do the research. So setting those initial boundaries is helpful just so you know where to start. But then you need to be ready for that to develop and change. I will add one more thing to what is a research question. Ideally, a research question builds on and recognizes the knowledge that has come before and the people that you want to be in conversation with. So if there are specific theories, methods, things you've read, thought about that have significantly influenced how you come to your question should be aware of that influence.
Okay. This is in some ways maybe the most important thing we'll talk about today, I would say. And that is the question of how do you come up with a research question? So what we've put here on some level seems obvious. It's really just to begin a conversation with you about what this looks like. So I've written, choose something interesting or meaningful to you. Kat put that even more strongly, right? Like a burning question, something you can, like, can't fall asleep at night without knowing the answer to, something that's really going to keep you motivated. Yes, I think that stuff is essential. It's essential in part because, again, like, you're not going to be, it's going to be difficult to complete a research question on a topic that you don't care about. Just to sustain your interest. I mean, the metaphor I use is, it's like you're never going to become a concert pianist or even be able to play a difficult piece if the only reason you're practicing is because your parents are making you practice, right? If you're doing this because you want to check off a line on your resume, if you're taking on a research project because you think it would make it, like, it's going to be hard for you to actually do it successfully. You might attain a decent level of proficiency just by, being forced to practice, and to keep my piano metaphor going. But really, to get into it, you're going to need something that really grabs you. So wherever you come up with this, well, anywhere. It might be something that you talked about in a course that you found really interesting that you want to explore further. It might be something you're reading about in your Twitter feed, or on the news. It might be something that's relates to your own life or experience in some way that piques your interest. Whatever it could be, there's a million places it could come from, but the key point is it has to be yours, right? It has to be something you come up with. Kat or I or Elaine or any of your professors, we can't give you a research question. We can have a conversation with you about the kinds of things that grab you, but that's much harder than when, if someone comes to my office and says, I want to do research, what should I write about? I initially think, like, we have some work to do here. If someone comes in and says, I'm really interested in X, right? Super. Then half the battle is won. Right? Then it's just all a matter of figuring out the details, even though the details are considerable. So, we want to talk about some ways that, as I've labeled it here, you can connect with your curiosity, right? So how can you get from that stage of, oh, here's a thing that I thought was kind of interesting, or we talked about this in class and I thought it was kind of cool. How can you really begin to develop that? All the stuff I put here, it's all, I'm limited by these goofy graphics that you can find easily on the internet, but it's all meant to suggest, like, a research question will not come to you
you froze, Michael.
Uh-oh.
Just for a moment.
Oh, is it better?
Yeah.
Okay. So yeah, like a research question just does not typically come to you like in its fully developed form. You've got to work to tease it out, right? And that often can take a very long time. And you can be actually deep into your research before you've fully figured out what the research question actually is. I mean, as somebody who has, done a lot of research and writing in my life at this point, published dozens of articles and a couple of books and whatever, like on my last book project, I wrote the entire book, submitted it to a press. It got rejected by the press. And only then was I able to step back from it when I read the reviewers' comments. Well, so then first I got furious and said horrible things and cursed people and threw stuff and, stomped around and was miserable to my friends and my partner and did all those things that you do. And then I got myself together and I stepped back and I was like, oh, I see, because this is what the book is really about. This is after 8 years of work and having written the thing in its entirety and submitted it to a press after having already published enough stuff. So it's hard is the point. You'll figure it out. And so at the early stages, what you need to do is be creative, right? You need to just play with ideas. I find in all the stuff you can hear, like this stuff that's on the screen represents my process a lot. I find writing a lot of things down, drawing pictures. I like to make diagrams with arrows and circles and things interacting with each other and just try to work through what it is that I'm interested in. And for me, it really helps for that to be kind of concrete and tangible and in ways that are kind of schematic or whatever. Other people's processes will look different, but the point is that you're not just going to sit down and say, oh, I got to think of a research question now. You need to really dig into what it is about that lecture that you thought was really interesting. Why did that book hold your attention? Why are you still thinking about that one article that you read? What was it about that conversation that has really stuck with you? And then develop that by working through it and really questioning and interrogating yourself and your own interests in light of that.
And my approach is very different from Michael's. I have to sort of feel things out. And so putting things in concrete terms doesn't work at all for me. So I actually fell into my first research project as an undergraduate for my thesis. I knew that I had these topics, huge topics, entire disciplines that I wanted to connect because that's what my major was. I was a double major in South Asian languages and civilizations and in theater. But I had no idea how to connect those things in a way that meant something to me. And I was at the grocery store with my mother, who's a professor. We bumped into one of her colleagues who was a professor who was like, oh, I did street theater in New Delhi, India in the 1980s. I could tell you about it and connect you with my friends who are still there. And it was the first time that like a light bulb went off, like, oh yes, this is what I want to study. And it was completely serendipitous. It felt to me like at the time, but looking back on it, if you just keep asking questions and expressing your interests, for those of you who are more affect-based in terms of how you think through things, eventually it will come into focus. But you just have to keep talking about it and thinking about it.
So we'll come back to that in our discussion here, but I want to come back to a part of this that often gives students a lot of difficulty, and that is getting clear on the difference between having a research topic and having a research question. So remember, we said a minute ago that a research question is clear, focused, concise, complex, and arguable, and it's going to guide your research. So I have a little game for us to play. The game is topic or question. Now, you don't have to know anything about this area substantively to be able to answer this, right? But I'm going to put up a bunch of things here on the screen, and I want you to tell me if it's a topic or a question and why. So here's the first one. I'm interested in how immigration affects politics. Topic or question?
Jasmine says topic.
Topic, correct. Why? How is it not a question?
It doesn't provide an argument of any source. It's just like stating something.
Right, so here you see a great example. This is not arguable. If you tell me you're interested in how immigration affects politics, I believe you. Like, there's no way I could say otherwise, right? That's not, first of all, that's not arguable. Also, it's, what else about this topic makes it
very
not
broad?
Super broad, right? It's neither clear nor concise nor focused. It's complex, potentially. Okay.
And before we move to the next one, it may be that this is where you start.
Absolutely.
Right, you don't have to have the research question ready to go, as we talked about. It may be that you're like, okay, I'm interested in how immigration affects politics, and you start poking around with that.
Right, so then you go here, or you go to the grocery store, or whatever it is for you, right? But that's maybe the launching off point. Okay, next one. I'm interested in how negative perceptions of immigrants affect politics. Topic or question?
Topic.
Topic, why?
People saying topic.
Yep, good, why?
It's not arguable, even though it's more concise than the last statement. It's not really worded in a question. Like, what types of negative perceptions, which immigrants specifically, and which country's politics is it specifically addressing?
Yeah, it's still not arguable. It's still pretty vague. There's a lot of questions here. It does have some additional focus, right? We're starting to get closer to something. But yeah, this is still a working through the process kind of. How about this? Topic or question?
Still a topic?
Still a topic, yep. How come?
Because this one is, although very concise and very direct, it's still not providing an argument. Like, it's not saying anything about the rhetoric about migrants and politics. Like, there's no argument over there.
Okay, good. Again, like we're getting there, right? And part of this exercise is for you to see. So in the last slide, I gave you index cards and sticky notes. Kat gave you a chance encounter at the grocery store, right? That's all part of how it actually looks, but you don't just instantly go from blank slate to question, right? So all of these things might be progressively like what you're coming up with as you're working through the process, right? Okay. What about this one? Anyone want to venture
Elin, Abby, and Corinne all say question.
Okay. Yeah. Why?
It has a scope. It has certain elements you study, like a certain perspective, and it have like a result that's arguable.
Okay. What about others? Abby, Corinne?
I think this one is very specific about, who are the politicians, European politicians. You're looking at rhetoric, specifically migrants to Europe, and how that's, causing mobilization of the right-wing voters. So you can really answer all of the like who, what, when, where, and your question is kind of looking at how that's happening.
Okay. What else?
There's like a potential kind of answer already in the question. Like the goal being to mobilize right-wing voters is already like in what they're proposing.
Okay, so we're starting to see how there might be sort of an answer or direction to this. What about this? Whoops. Sorry, what about this? I mean, I don't want to play guess what I'm thinking. Just a slightly even more focused version of the same thing, right? So I'd say to me, these last two are getting to be research questions, right? And it was just to sort of show you how you might really, even when you've got a research question, how are politicians in Europe using rhetoric about immigrants to mobilize right-wing voters? It might be that you end up with something even more specific, like by the time you're all done, right? And again, I'm going to say this now, we'll probably say it again, but it applies to everything we're saying. I mean, I've given you an example that's kind of a political sciencey example, because that's what I know, because I'm a political scientist at some level, right? What this is going to look like for you might be really different in terms of the specifics, right? It's so I don't want to give the impression. I mean, I think it's a general rule about everything that we're saying today that it might look slightly different for you. It almost surely will, given your interests and your subject area, right? But the general point to make is that you can really clearly see the difference, hopefully, between the first and the last bullet point here in terms of the focus, the concision, the clarity, the complexity, and the ability for it to be argued.
And I would like to ask, looking at this, what do you think this person's burning question is? How would you phrase it? What's the thing that keeps them up at night?
Maybe like, why are immigrants being constantly negatively affected, or like not given like the right treatment? I don't know.
Yeah, I think you're onto it. I think it's something around why are immigrants causing nationalism to reemerge in all of these cultures.
Or even just, why are immigrants constantly getting demonized?
Yeah.
Right? And then working through what that looks like. Notice that from the very first thing, I'm interested in how immigration affects politics. This might have gone in multiple different directions. It could have been a question about what kind of impact do immigrants have on the economy, right? Which is a question that gets a lot of play in the social sciences and which is much more of an empirical, well, not much more of a, but a different kind of empirical question, right? Looking at everything like contributions in terms of taxes that are paid and roles they play in the economy, the kinds of jobs that immigrants might hold, how they affect economic growth. Economists have tried to answer a question like this for a long time, and it can be very complex, right? It could also be like, how do the values that people bring with them from different places shape the political culture of a particular society in which they arrive, right? And then that would be yet another research question that might emerge out of taking it in that direction. So,
or if you came at it from a completely different discipline, but you could still start with how immigration affects politics from, say, theater, and say how are performances of migrant identity showing up in television shows on Netflix.
Right. So, and we could, you know, if we were super clever, we could sit here and multiply these examples all day across a zillion disciplines, right? The point is just to say, getting from topic to question is itself part of the research process, right? You don't often know when you have a topic what your question is going to be. Discovering that question is about that sort of getting in touch with your curiosity, right? Figuring out what it is that really drives you, and figuring out, like, so if you're worried about why immigrants are constantly demonized by politicians, you know, a question like this one might be a thing that would help to give you an answer to that, right? But a slightly different motivating question, or a slightly different underlying, like, burning question might have taken you in a completely different direction from this topic. So once you've got a question, there are some other things, or as you're developing a question, there's some other things to think about. Kat talked earlier about scope. How broad is the question going to be? It has to be broad enough to let you, you know, satisfy your curiosity, answer the thing that's motivating you. It has to be narrow enough to be able to guide your research, right? You don't want a topic that is unmanageable. So unmanageable can be a function of overly broad. It can also be a question of feasibility, right? Do you have the time, the skills, data, everything that you need to really do this research? And then also, and importantly, is there a faculty member who's willing and able to guide me in doing this? So, you know, those are questions you need to keep in mind, I guess I would say. Scope is something that's in your control. Like, we can work with you, your advisors can work with you to define the scope of the project. Feasibility is a slightly trickier thing. You know, if you need to do advanced econometrics to answer your question and you have trouble with addition and subtraction, then that's going to be a challenge for you, right? If you would need data that you can't get, or that it's going to take you 4 years to gather, and you only have your senior year to do your project, that's going to be a problem for you. And you know, you need to have a faculty member whose person does not have to work on exactly your topic, right? But you need to have somebody who's willing to, like, get in there with you and help you think through some of this stuff. Because as beginning researchers, you know, you're not going to be able to necessarily do all this work of honing your research question yourself, making sure the scope stays manageable, making sure that you're gathering the right kind of data, et cetera, right? So finding a faculty mentor early in the process is super important.
Is now a good time to talk about how you do that? Or I forget if you have a slide for that later.
About how one finds a faculty mentor?
Yeah.
Yeah, no, this is a good time to talk about. I don't think there's a...
When you are thinking about a faculty mentor, often you will find that your research doesn't fit exactly with any one faculty member. So then it is your responsibility to look at their research and the topics that they teach and articulate to them why you think you might be a good fit with them. Often somebody who may seem like they don't have as much in common with you, but they're asking similar questions to the questions you're asking. So say we go back to the previous slide, you're interested in politics and immigration, and you find a faculty member who approaches politics and immigration from a really different perspective, but also looks at those questions. That could be a person worth approaching. But you want to make sure you go in knowing a little bit about their work and their experiences and being able to articulate how that contributes to your project.
So all of this takes time. This is really just an opportunity to summarize some of what we've said. All of this takes time. You usually start off with a topic. You need to read, think, discuss with your mentor, with your friends, keeping in mind that your goal is ultimately get to a research question that's clear, focused, concise, complex, and arguable, that's going to provide you with that guidance and orientation that you need. Then you're going to revise, refine, and revisit your question again and again and again. You're going to do some preliminary research. Then you're going to revise your question. Then you're going to talk to some experts. That's going to be your faculty mentor, but also just other people you know who are thinking about this question. And that's going to mean talking to experts in the sense of, you know, reading what they're saying, right? Reading their own research and being in a kind of in conversation with them intellectually in that sort of way, right? And you're going to keep refining and refining the question. It's perfectly natural and normal and necessary for the question to evolve. And it's an iterative and collaborative process, right? One that really takes time. Let me pause there and just get out of this screen share. I mean, we're not quite to the discussion slide yet, but I feel like it's a moment where we should have a pause just because we've been going for a while. And I want to give people a chance to ask any questions you have and or to just get up and stretch and do whatever you need to do to take a little break. Anyone have any questions or anything we can clarify for you at this point? Helene?
I had a question regarding when you think the best time to be involved in research is.
You mean in terms of your undergraduate career?
Yes, like what year do you think would be best to start?
I mean, I think it's always, I think any time is a good time. I mean, if you're wanting to do the BPhil, you know, we could count back from, like, we can quite literally, we've worked out when it's optimal to start. And when it's optimal to start is kind of spring of your second year into summer. You know, you can't start later than that, but that's like for the ideal plenty of time trajectory. But, you know, there's all kinds of ways you can get involved with research. You know, you might find a faculty member to work with on the faculty member's research project over the summer, or you might want to, you know, dip your toe into writing something for the, you know, some sort of student publication, or develop something you've written in a class just to sort of see if you enjoy it. So I think it's never too early. But I definitely think that, you know, late in the second year or very beginning of your third year is kind of optimal for the BPhil, if that's what you're thinking about.
And I will add that because we've been emphasizing taking time with this, the more time you give yourself to find your research question, the happier you will be with the process. And so if you're attending this, it's time to just start thinking about it. And that doesn't have to be a very active process, nor does it have to be super hard work at this point, but it needs to be sort of on the back burner of your brain, that this is the kind of topic you're interested in, and maybe in a class this semester, you can write a paper that's related to that topic. And maybe that will help you kind of narrow down what you want to do. Like the earlier you have a vague idea, the better.
Okay, thank you.
Anyone else? Is there anything we can mystify or any reaction you had? Is anything surprising to you about this? Or are you feeling like, okay, I can do this? Or feeling like, oh my God, it seems overwhelming? Like, yeah, so Elin posted in the chat here like a possible question. Yeah, I think that's certainly getting close to a question, right? It's fairly specific.
We can't see it, Michael.
Oh, sorry, you can't. Oh, it's directly to me. Sorry. Elin, I don't want to talk about your question publicly if you don't want me to.
Yeah, it's okay. I'll put in the public chat. I just wasn't sure if this is a...
Sure. No, it's a good chance for us to think. So people can now see in the chat this question. I mean, I certainly feel like one thing that we might say about a question like this is that it's already, and this is very commonplace, right? It's already kind of assuming some things that it's good to unpack and be aware of, right? So there's an assumption of international health regulations having failed, and that having been an issue in terms of leading to the kind of crummy cooperation that we've seen globally on COVID-19 response. So that's totally okay at an early stage. You just want to be aware of that assumption, because it may be that what you discover is that the problem was not, and I mean, I am now like making things up because I don't know anything about this topic, right? So please don't take this as a like, oh, he knows something and he's commenting substantively, because I really don't know. But it could be the case that it wasn't international health regulations that failed. It could be that there's some other explanation, right? So if your burning question is, how do we explain the, what seems to many people like an inadequate response globally to the COVID-19 pandemic, you should stay open for a while to alternative possible explanations, right? It may not have been health regulations. It may have been national politics that were driving different countries' reactions that hampered an effective global response, or it might have been lack of funding for those to implement those regulations, or whatever, right? So you just always want to make sure that as you're in the early stages, you're allowing yourself to be open to multiple possible answers to your question, right? Because if you go into something with too clear an idea in mind, it can affect the way you look at evidence. It can affect the authorities that you look at, and so on. But
so the way I would put it is, Elin, it's obvious that you have a specific burning question, which, as Michael stated, is something along the lines of why has the response to COVID-19 globally been so miserable?
Right, right.
But then in order to turn that into your research question, if what interests you is these international health regulations, the research question you want to ask is, what did the international health regulations do or not do to guide the WHO during COVID?
I think my burning question is definitely why we didn't have a more effective global cooperation. What factor can contribute to a better cooperation when we facing such a global crisis? And I was trying to respond to that question with WHO, and with some research I have done, I learned that they're using international health regulations as their guiding laws to do all their stuff. So do you think if it's better if I rephrase it in a way that's like a more open ending, or if I should like?
So I definitely would rephrase it to be more open-ended.
Okay.
And I would also say that if your focus is around, if you've decided what interests you is these international health regulations, I think that your specific research question has to ask yourself how international health regulations influence global cooperation.
Okay. This brings up another really important point, and thanks, Elin, for sharing the question with the group, because I think it's a great way for us to like have a concrete example around some of what we've been talking about. When you're taking on a big research project like a BPhil, say, it's not always the case that the question can be neatly put in a single sentence, right? So Elin's burning question is like, why the miserable global response to the pandemic? You might lead with something like that, and then say, critics have observed that there's been this problem and this problem and this problem and this problem, and we've seen this and this and that. So, what's motivating this research is, the attempt to understand why. And then from that, you might say, a bunch of scholars have proposed different possibilities, and you rattle off some people have said it's inadequate international health regulations. Some have said it's like the desire for governments to avoid embarrassment, and so they don't want to share good data or cooperate or be forthcoming. Some have said it's lack of sufficient resources for the WHO to do its work, or like you could run through a bunch of possibilities and say, I'm going to focus on this, or I'm going to explore the importance of this piece of it, or my argument is going to shed light on how this thing worked, right? So it may be that in the course of we're from high school we're taught to think in terms of like a thesis sentence, which is great, but it took me 10 pages to set up the research question in the book that I was referring to earlier, because it was a pretty complex question by the time it was all said and done. And I had to give some background, and I had to really say what was driving it. So at the end of the day, I can formulate the hypothesis or the argument of that book, down to a single sentence or two, but it doesn't really do justice to the complexity of the project, right? But the point is, I can only get there at the very end of the day. Right. So partly, I think, Elin, you've got something that's going to, with a little bit more of an open-ended framing, is going to get you off to a good start on the project. Right. And what the question ends up being, you'll work out in the course of pushing the research forward.
Yeah, what I have done is like I have looked bunch of scholars from like different perspective, economists, public health experts, politicians, their explanation of why we have a miserable global cooperation. And I was trying to fit in this discussion from WHO policy level and to see what could this be a factor that contribute to it.
Yeah, and I mean, I think you're doing the right thing by reading widely, trying to understand what people in different areas are saying, and then feeding that all back into your own process for developing the question and pushing it forward. Let me go back here to the slides because I'm noticing the time and wanting to make sure that we have a chance to cover all the topics here. Oops. So what's a global studies research question? Well, for lots of you who are taking Intro to Global Studies, we're learning what global studies is all about, or some of you I know obviously took it last term with me. Some of you may have had it before, but global studies is really about connections, right? It's really about studying transnational processes and the connections, divisions, disruptions, inequalities, and also the productive possibilities that those engender across time and space. That's just the Global Studies Center mission statement, at least the first part of it. But that's really what global studies does. So a global studies research question is going to be one that looks at processes that cross boundaries and that pays attention to the effects of those processes now or in the past. That's pretty broad. And, I guess I think that there's, I don't know how strongly I want to put this. Let me just say, it's very difficult for me to think of a question that might not be reworked into a global studies question. So I don't want to spend too much time on this now, in part because the answer is going to look so different for you all individually. I do think it's helpful, and this is mainly again for people who are thinking of the BPhil, to think just really quickly a little bit about what isn't or isn't necessarily a global studies question. So a study that's focused on another country, right? I'm really interested in the wars of dynastic succession in country X in the whatever century. Not necessarily a global studies question, although it could be, right? A study that compares two countries, if those are conceived of as independent units, meaning I'm going to compare the healthcare system in the US and Canada. Okay, that's a cool project if that's what you're interested in, and that can be done really well or really interestingly. It's not framed that way, a global studies question, right? Because it's treating these two countries as independent units and making a comparison between similarities and differences. A global studies version of that would say, what are the factors that have, shaped healthcare outcomes in the US and Canada or something. A study that speaks to a topic of global importance. Just because your topic is a global one doesn't mean that you've formulated it in a way that's paying attention to cross-border processes and their kind of effects, and especially to making those connections that are so distinctive of global studies. So just because your topic is climate change doesn't mean that you framed your question as a global studies question, right? It could easily, but it's not automatic. So I just run through those, and I'm happy to answer any questions anybody has about that. But it's just to sort of say, if you want to do the BPhil, you'll need to be paying attention to framing your question in a way that makes sure that it speaks to those global processes, those border crossing processes, and their effects. Does that make some sense to people? Okay, let's dig into the research process. What do you notice about this picture with respect to a process? Anything odd about this as a depiction of a process?
It's a cycle and it doesn't have really an end.
Yeah, excellent. It doesn't have a starting or an ending point that's neat and obvious, right? It really is an iterative process. So, formulating your question or your argument, situating your research, gathering data, and analyzing it and refining the question, all of that is going to be stuff you're going to do recursively throughout the research itself. And we'll talk about each of these steps a little bit. But the research process, in other words, so like you've got your question, or at least an early version of it, and you're sort of charging in, what are you going to do? I mean, I think it's reasonable to pick any of these as data analysis and interpretation is probably not going to be the initial starting point because you got to gather some data before you can analyze it, right? So we'll start with sort of gathering data just because it's an easy place to start. But the point is just to say that the process is a continuous one. One thing we did want to point out, though, sometimes you need funding to carry out your research. And most often that's to do with gathering the data. So if your data requires you to, interview a bunch of people in a certain place in the world, or to gather a certain kind of data that requires you to visit an archive someplace, or that requires you to purchase data sets, or whatever it might be, you might need funding, right? And getting funding, applying for and securing funding can be a super time-consuming part of the whole research process. So, early on, you'll want to be aware of whether or not you're going to need funding to carry out your work. And if so, to figure out where that funding is going to come from. There's lots and lots and lots and lots of places to get money for undergraduate research around Pitt. This is the one time in your careers when people would be falling all over themselves to give you money, because like supporting undergraduate research is a big priority for Pitt and lots of other universities. So, some of the USIST centers have resources for this. The nationality rooms have great resources for this. The Office of Undergraduate Research, the Honors College, these are all places where you might find money that's fairly easy to get because it's internal to Pitt. But it's just to say that you should pay attention early on to the fact that, if you do need funding, you should start looking for it early.
I will add just really briefly that when you are applying for funding, if you do, it will seem like you have to have your project way farther along than you actually do. This is just part of the hoop that you jump through. You have to be specific about your research and your research question when you propose for funding, but it can change afterwards once you get the funding.
Yeah, grant applications are not contracts, right? They are they're descriptions of what you're planning to do, and everybody understands that the thing that comes out in the end is not going to look exactly like the thing you proposed. So, yeah, don't let that be an impediment. So, situating your research. Research is a conversation, right? It's not a conversation that's taking place like live and synchronously, or in person and synchronously, as we're now taught to say by the pandemic, right? It's a conversation that's happening across time and space, often through scholarly writing, although not only through scholarly writing, for sure. And so your work should connect to wider debates, right? It should, as was said earlier, address a gap or something. The ways in which your work connects to wider debates, there's two things. First, there's what's often called the literature review. I think this is a super important but very misleading way to describe this process of situating your research. But basically what you want to do is critically engage with the field that you're making an intervention in. So you want to say, here's what other people have been saying about this topic. And, here's what I think is good, helpful, worrisome, problematic, missing from, provocative, whatever about that. And here's what my contribution is going to be, right? The reason a literature review sounds is misleading is because it can give the impression that what you want to do is just kind of summarize all the literature that's out there in the field. And that's not really true. What you want to do is characterize that literature in a way that sets up your research question. Right, so just to make it concrete, if Elin was writing about the COVID-19 response globally, there's going to be a lot of literature already about this. So she might want to identify trends within that. There's a bunch of commentators who basically think it's this, and there's a bunch of commentators who basically think it's that. And then there's this third school of thought that puts it down to this other thing. And what I'm going to do is show that it's all of them or none of them, and actually something else, or whatever her intervention is going to be, right? When we say that your work should make an intervention, that can mean all kinds.
One more thing on the literature review.
Yeah, please.
Is that for most people, this is the hardest part to write. It will sound the worst. It will feel the most awkward. And probably the first time you write it, it will be terrible. Don't despair. Everybody gets through the literature review. It's the thing that you will draft the most times, probably. So just get through it.
The other thing I would say is I think a lot of people make a mistake at the literature review stage, which is that they try to get the literature review just right before they write the rest of the thing. And actually, the lit review is one of the last things that you'll finish up, because once you know what your argument is and what you want to say, that's gonna determine how you're going to present the literature that you've been engaging with, right? So it's not a preliminary hurdle; it's a thing that you work with across the whole project. But and I should step back and say, Kat and I are talking about a literature review as if you all know what a literature review is. It's such a fundamental part of academic writing that we maybe take it for granted. But the point is just to say that as part of situating your research in this ongoing conversation, you will characterize the research that's out there in a way that highlights your intervention and why your intervention is important, right? So that's what a lit review does in the broadest sense. Now, that intervention can look like a lot of things. It can be an evaluation of arguments that are already out there. It can be an expansion of what people have already been talking about to bring in new or fresh insights or perspectives or ideas. It can be a challenge to the existing framework. It can be adjudicating between rival hypotheses. It can be testing or refining a view that's already out there to make it more responsive to certain conditions, or to extend its reach to new areas, or there's a million things that an intervention in the field can be, right? But you ought to be able to say what kind of intervention you're making, right? That's going to be an important piece of this whole process. Gathering data. This is probably the hardest of all the things to talk about in general, because what this looks like for you is going to be hugely different from what it's going to look like for others, just depending on your topics. So it could be data sets or empirical data, it could be research and by reading books or articles or archives, it could be lab work, it could be field work or interviews, it could be a creative exercise, as Kat was mentioning at the outset. There's a million things this could be, but you're going to gather the data that you need to answer your question. right? So the question is going to tell you what data you need, right? You need all the data you need to answer your question and none of the other data. That's an empty statement, but the point is just to say, like when you can say, and my question is X, you know, how politicians use anti-migrant rhetoric to mobilize right-wing voters, then it's immediately obvious what I need. I need to look at the discourse and the rhetoric of politicians who are demonizing immigrants. I need to look at the voting behavior of right-wing voters. I need to look at the election outcomes in the countries that are part of my study, right? So right there, I now have a bunch of data that I know I need to look at to be able to give an answer to my question. Data analysis and interpretation. This is another hard, I mean, they're all the parts are hard, all the parts are fun, all the parts are frustrating, all the parts are, you know, require you to be imaginative and creative and what have you. Just thinking a lot about what you're finding, whether that means your reflection, trying to work out arguments, whether that means trying new thing in your own like creative practice, whether that means running regression analysis if you're doing statistical work, like whatever it is, you've got to think about the data and what it's telling you in relation to your question, right? This part often takes longer, I think, than people anticipate that it will, because the facts don't speak for themselves, right? And often it feels like we have to coerce them into talking, right? They don't want to divulge things to us. So you need to have time just to think and reflect. And as we'll talk about later on, the writing process is often where that reflection happens. Now, once you've thought about your data and analyzed it a bit, you're gonna refine your question. Almost, I mean, you know, if I say I guarantee you that every one of you who goes on to write a thesis will end up refining your question after the initial data collection and analysis, one of you might prove me wrong, but I'd be willing to place a pretty substantial bet. It's totally normal. It's also not cheating, right? I've had students say to me, well, like, I had this question and then I did this research and I found out that it's something else. So like, doesn't that mean like that I failed or that I did it wrong? No. We expect that your question is going to be you know, clarified and deepened as you learn more and as you think more. So this is again why it's so important to start early, right? Because you just don't know. As your question is refined, you might discover that, oh, I need some more data that I didn't originally realize I was going to need. Or, oh, I really have to go back and now rethink that lit review. Or, oh, there's a whole bunch of other stuff I really ought to read now because I'm thinking about the question differently. So refining the question is, again, it's not a indication of a problem or a misstep or anything else. It's just a normal part of the research process. At some point, you'll formulate your argument. An argument is a story you tell about your data, right? And when I use the word data, again, let me just emphasize, like, this might be the paintings that you're discussing, right? This might be the poetry that you're interpreting or analyzing. This might be the economic data on unemployment that you're assessing. I mean data to in the broadest possible sense here, the stuff that you're working with, right? And your argument is just the story that you're going to tell about your data. And it's going to answer your research question. It's going to do that by relating the data and your interpretation of it back to this bigger conversation that's going on about your topic, right? So you You're going to have a bunch of data. You're going to think about it. You're going to refine your question, get some more data, think about it some more. You're going to tell a story about that answers your question and does so in a way that connects it up to that broader debate that you're trying to make an intervention. So when we talk about your argument, we don't mean like a specific point you make in a forensics exercise, right? We don't mean the particular rejoinder you give when somebody makes a particular point. Elin?
I have a quick question. So should we have our argument before the data collection and interpretation or after we find out what's going on?
Okay. So you're shaking your head?
I was shaking my head. You can have a hypothesis, which is the same as in a scientific experiment, which is what you think the data is going to show you. But until you've worked through what the data actually does show you, it will be very difficult for you to have an argument.
Right, and good research practice actually suggests that it's really important to be clear on that distinction between an argument and a hypothesis, right? Because if you know the answer to the question before you do the research, that's bad research practice, right? Because the data is supposed to guide your understanding of the question and inform your answer. So, like in an extreme case, you would never manipulate the data in order to make sure that it matches the argument that you came into things wanting to make, right? Or if you did do that, you'd be violating research ethics and you'd actually be in big trouble. So I'm not suggesting, of course, that anyone would do that, but the point is a much more insidious version of that can happen when we go into something pretty confident that we already know the answer. That's going to color how we're going to interpret the data. It's going to affect the way we now. So again, it's tricky.
I actually have a pretty good example of this. I went into my research for my dissertation thinking that the question that I was asking was how people were using the arts and performance to respond to a particular cultural moment, which involved a woman being gang raped and huge protests throughout India. And I went to go do my research, and without realizing it, just in that question, I had a really big assumption about what my argument was going to be, which is that I assumed that it did have an effect, that this cultural moment shifted how performers were thinking about their work. And as soon as I got there, every performer that I talked to would get almost angry with me and tell me that they'd been talking about these issues long before this cultural moment happened, and they would be talking about them long after, and that the way that they talked about them was specifically antithetical to this cultural moment. And so not only did I realize that I had made assumptions about my argument before doing the research, but those assumptions about the argument had actually negatively impacted my research question. And so I had to take a step back and ask a different research question because it simply was not as relevant as I thought that it was.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that, Kat. I think it's a great example in a second way beyond what you just shared, which is that in that example, Kat didn't do anything wrong or nefarious or make any kind of mistake, at least in the sense of a mistake that she could have avoided, right? She did what a researcher does. She had a hypothesis, she went into things, and then when confronted with the data, with the world, when she began the process, she was forced to take a step back and to rethink and refine and reformulate and go forward again, right? Like that's normal. What's a problem is if she had heard what all these people were saying and had ignored them or something, right? Or had been so blind that she never really like talked to the right people in the first place, or God forbid, tried to write it without actually going and talking to people at all. Right? There's all kinds of ways you could go wrong there.
Yeah, and I would say that the other part of that is important, I think, for all of you is that paying attention not only to whether you have a hypothesis, but to whether your question itself shuts down certain opportunities for the research that you're doing. Because you will find pretty quickly that no matter how well researched you are, when you actually start doing the specific research to answer your question, it's not going to directly answer your question. It's going to answer a slightly different question most of the time. And so be ready for that to happen, and be ready to not only shift your hypothesis, but your question itself.
So formulating the argument requires that you know the data, that you understand what the data has to do with the question, and that you find a clear way to communicate this to other people, right? Those are all pretty basic things, but it's just to say that ultimately the argument will take shape over the course of things, right? It's not something that you work out all at once or in advance, right? But that itself is part of the process. So then situating your research, we're back around the circle, right? Good arguments relate the research to the wider debates. So you want to be able to explain how your argument makes some kind of contribution or intervention in this debate and what its wider significance might be. You want to be able, as we often put it, to answer the so what question, right? If you can't answer the so what question, you need to think a little bit more about your argument and how it connects back to these wider debates. I'll just say parenthetically, this is a huge problem in political science, I think. People do super technical, I mean, that's my own discipline, so I can criticize it. People do super technical, highly powered statistical research on questions that no one cares about the answer to, including them, right? They just did it because they had some data and they could answer the question. Then you say, okay, well, so what? I had a professor in grad school. He was famous. His name was Brian Walker. And he always asked this question that we called the Walker question. So people would come in for a job talk, which is when you're interviewing for an academic job and you come in and you present your dissertation research or part of it to the faculty in the department that's trying to hire you. And Walker would always say, suppose everything you've said is true. What would I do? People would stop in their tracks because they couldn't say, right? Now, lots of them could have had things to say if they'd have thought about it. But the point is you want to be attentive to this wider, and it doesn't have to be I've cured cancer or I've solved the riddle of the meaning of life, right? We're not saying that you have to have a question that is, that's going to answer some cosmically important, but you want to be able to say, like, here's how this relates to what people have been thinking, and here's why that matters, right? And articulating that is part of the process.
The way I put it is, why should we care? And that goes back to, if you've done a good job of formulating your burning question, you will know why you care, and you will be better able to articulate why someone else should care.
Another thing to say here is, who that we is in why should we care is going to vary depending on your topic and the question, right? So the we might be we scholars of medieval illuminated manuscripts.
Absolutely.
Right? In which case, if you can give a compelling answer to that audience, then that's great if that's what your question or topic deals with, right? The we might be humankind. The we might be anything in between, right? So it's not, again, it's about relating your argument back to the wider debate that you're intervening in, right? And that's the audience for whom the so what question has to be answered. Anything anyone wanted to ask here? We've reached another one of these get up and stretch and also, you know, again, we encourage you to chime in whenever, but you know, a designated moment for us to stop and ask.
And I don't want to speak for Michael, but anything that you aren't comfortable asking here or not ready to ask here, you can always get in touch at a later date over email, and we can set up a Zoom call to check in about anything you'd like.
Absolutely. We're throwing a ton at you, and partly it's just trying to keep your heads above water as the successive waves of information come flooding out. Abby.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask more about the data collection method. So, like, how do you suggest we get started on, you know, finding resources or materials for kind of our preliminary, you know, research on looking at the topic?
So that's so dependent on your interests. So are you okay with us using you as an example?
Yeah, sure. So I'm looking to apply to the BPhil for Asian Studies, and I really want to look at the different engagements that South Korean media has with North Korea. So kind of looking at how people in North Korea illegally consume South Korean media, and also how like South Korean media recently has had a lot of, you know, different shows, whether that's dramas or like reality shows about North Korean like defectors. So I was just trying to think about like, what are the different resources I could start looking at for that?
So one of the first resources for a field like that, which is, I think, more like what I do than what Michael does, though it has overlap, is that you have this amazing library at Pitt. And you have librarians who are trained in specialized topics, who have spent time in those libraries and know what kinds of resources are available. So the first thing that you can do is actually reach out to the librarian who is in charge of your topic. And probably there's a librarian who does Asian studies, would be my guess. And say, you know, here's what I'm interested in. Do you have any sources you would direct me to immediately? And that can be a way to start. And then I also always use the bibliographies of sources that I like. So if you read something and you're like, this is so interesting and relates to what I'm thinking about, look at who they cite and then find those things. And then look at who they cite and find those things, because that will give you a genealogy of the academic literature around what you're thinking about.
The thing is, let me share a slide that's coming up later, and maybe I need to rethink the order I put this in, but you know, methods are going to be related to questions and data. Right? So how you think about all this stuff is going to be determined by your question, and it's going to vary by discipline. So talking to the appropriate librarian or bibliographer is going to be important. Making sure that you look at, you know, given your interest, you're going to want to look at, you know, whatever specific forms of media, for instance, are the ones that are relevant for you. So that may mean getting access to you know, video archives, or that may mean, you know, you may need, depending on your language ability, you may need help with some interpretation or translation. You may need, you know, so all of that stuff is going to be work you're gonna you know, have to figure out as you go. But it's also why it's so important to identify a mentor early on, as we were saying, because that person will be the crucial person in helping you know exactly how to go about that.
I will also say that Pitt's basic library search function is the best I've ever seen. In terms of if you just type in a keyword, it will point you towards some sources. So if you type in South Korea, North Korea film, you'll find things, which a lot of university library websites you would not.
The other thing is, don't be shy of talking to faculty, even if you don't ultimately think that person's going to be your mentor. Most faculty are very happy to respond to an email or to chat with you in office hours, give you a little bit of direction, even if ultimately they're not going to be the person working with you, right? So you can just always reach out to people as well.
Yeah, the thing about most faculty is that they are overworked, but also so delighted when students show an interest. Like, we love when students are like, I'm excited about research. We're like, wow, join us. This is amazing. So don't be afraid if we seem a little harried at first. It doesn't mean we're not interested in what you do. It just means there's other stuff going on.
Michaela.
Yeah, so as far as like getting that first research experience, like before the BPhil, how do you go about approaching faculty if you're interested in doing research? And how do you find a faculty member that's maybe doing or exploring a topic that also interests you? And should you like present your question, or can you kind of get on board with what they're already doing?
Yeah, so this varies a lot, again, by field, right? Like in my department, every semester, and I'm in political science, obviously, and every semester we put out a list of faculty who have projects that they're looking for students to work on. And so you could look there to that list, if that were true in your department, to to sign on to some of those projects. Another thing you can do is try to identify faculty members whose interests overlap with yours, and you could approach them to ask whether or not they need any kind of research assistance. I mean, I'll tell you a thing that happens, which is that faculty frequently get approached by students who want to be involved in research, and then the students agree to do a certain amount of research, or agree to a certain thing, and then students don't follow through because they get busy or because they didn't realize that they were taking on something that was going to be big. So faculty may be a little reticent about agreeing to an initial request if you don't know them in particular. So a thing that I would really recommend is reaching out to faculty members who you know, like you've already done well in their class, you've already established some kind of relationship with them. When I get the random email from a student I've never met who says they're interested in doing research with me, do I have any topics that they could help with, or do I need any research assistance? I mean, immediately I'm asking, well, who is this person and how do I know they're going to come through and whatever else, because it can be problematic when you're counting on someone to do something and then they don't follow through. So having those relationships, I'd say it's probably more useful to do some research with a faculty member you have a relationship with, even if it's not directly on your topic, because it gives you the flavor and it gives you an opportunity to talk with them about their research process. And like for a very early experience, I wouldn't worry so much about it being topically like right on, something that's in the general direction of your interests, but where you feel like you can actually build on that good relationship and take advantage of the faculty member's expertise is probably going to work out better than. The other thing is the faculty member could be a jerk, right? Like, I don't want to put all the things on the students, right? You might reach out to some faculty member you don't know, and it turns out the person is unpleasant. And I'm not pointing any fingers at anyone specific, but, like there's plenty of people around who it's like, yeah.
I spent my entire PhD career with an unpleasant advisor, and it definitely affected my ability to do good research and think through research questions. That relationship is important.
So do you advise against like the kind of cold email? Because that's kind of like, I already have kind of an idea of what I want to do, so it's harder to go in and mesh that with like existing professors and the work that they're doing. And I've found that it might be easier to just kind of like look into other people who are doing research that might be more relevant. But at the same time, like those aren't people that I've really worked with, or even maybe departments that I've worked in. So that might make it kind of difficult.
So this for me is where the thing I said earlier about doing your homework first is important. So if there's someone who you really think would be a good fit, look at their work. And when you send that email, it should be about a paragraph long, and it should explain why you think they would be a good fit based on the work you have already done. Professors are normal humans. They like a good ego stroke. So if you're like, your research into this question, I think relates in these ways to the kinds of questions I'm asking, they're way more likely to be like, okay, this person is asking from a place of actually having thought about this. What none of us like, and I'm sure you don't like it either, we all have limited time. And so don't waste our time. When I say don't waste our time, I don't mean don't come to us with questions, concerns, creative ideas. I mean, don't come to us without having done your homework first.
Got it. That makes sense. Thank you.
The other thing I'd just say, and then I'm noticing people are starting to have to go. I don't know how long this was scheduled for, but I will go back to zooming through some of the slides, maybe just to make sure we, cover most of the bases. I kind of was operating on the assumption, maybe I misunderstood. Anyway, if there's a faculty member who you've really identified as you think that might be the great person to work with, I'd take a class with that person, even if the class isn't on the topic that you want to do research on, right? Like show up and do well. And that will give you a lot of credibility with the person in terms of getting them to be willing to invest their time in advising you. Again, like if I have a student who I've never taught who comes to me and says, will you advise my BPhil thesis? I'm kind of like, I don't know. Who are you? Are you serious? Like, how do I know you're gonna I don't know, maybe I will, maybe I won't. Like I need to know you better. So it's always much better when a student who's in my class or has been in one of my classes in the past comes to me and says, oh, I'm thinking of doing this, would you be willing to do it? And I know that person works hard and asks good questions and is serious. And then I'm like, oh yeah, that's an easier, it's not that I haven't taken on students who I've never met before, but I like make them jump through hoops and do stuff to prove that they're going to not be flaky, right? Because it's actually a big investment of our time to work with somebody on a project like this. And I don't want to, like Kat said, I don't want to waste my time, and I don't want to waste your time if it turns out that, if you're the kind of student who's constantly turning things in late or, phoning things in or whatever, like probably you're not ready to take on a research project yet until you're at a different stage in your life or career. So yeah, just establishing that rapport is, I think, crucial, and however you do it.
I will also repeat that you don't necessarily, for a mentor, need the faculty member who works on the topic that is closest to your own. What you need is someone who you can develop a good relationship with, who is interested in similar kinds of questions. You are the one who will bring the specialized knowledge about your specific topic. So when I say that, I don't necessarily mean that, like, if you want to study Italian Renaissance art, that you should ask a contemporary art scholar to be your mentor. But if you want to study Italian Renaissance art because you're asking questions about the female form, you may find that someone in gender studies who's interested in the female form is a better fit for you than someone who studies Italian Renaissance art. And so being open to someone who doesn't know your topic but knows your approach is definitely something to think about.
Okay, let me, sure we have more questions, but let me go back to the discussion here just to make sure we get through some of these remaining points, because I think they're important. I'll try and go through this a little more quickly because I am conscious of people needing to go. And then we'll come back and have, you know, a chance to discuss at the end. But the writing process itself is a huge piece of doing research. And as we stressed earlier, you know, writing is itself a way of thinking. And it's kind of the best and really the only way you can clarify your argument, right? You can't, at least you have to be a lot smarter than I am if you're able to work it all out in your head in advance and then just like type it up directly out of your head. Like that has not been my experience, and it's not really anyone's experience that I know. So you have to sort of write through it, right? You develop your argument through the writing process. And it takes forever, and it hurts, and it's amazing, right? It just, like, when you have a great day of writing, you feel great, like, for a long time. When you have a bad day of writing, it's most days, you know? So that's just how it goes. I mean, I'm sometimes excited when I deleted a paragraph and that was my day's writing achievement for the day, right? Because that paragraph was really in my way. It was really blocking me from understanding the direction my argument wanted to go. So, you know, we could elaborate tons of examples here, but writing process itself takes a long time. For a BPhil, I always say you need a full semester to write it up, right? That's after the data gathering and analysis, You need a full semester just to try and write the thing up in its initial draft form. And again, that's not a problem. That's not to be, it's just the way it goes. So start early, make outlines, write every day. This is so important, right? Try and get into a good habit of writing, because some days will go better than others. And even on those days that feel like bad writing days, what you come to understand is that your brain is working stuff out. So even if not much gets onto the page that day that's worth keeping, like, progress is happening. Right?
Can I just briefly interrupt to say, also everyone has different writing processes that work for them, and don't guilt or shame yourself if what Michael is saying isn't what works for you. I don't write every day. I do write it all in my head, and once I sit down to type, everything comes out almost in its completed form. But the way that I do that is I take really specific notes on everything that I read. So I have, like, everything I want from what I've read is typed up. So that's what takes me the most time. But that means that most of this, I also don't outline. And that's fine.
Yeah. So, you know, yeah, I mean, everyone's process is going to, as Kat said, is going to vary. So, you know, again, for me, this is part of the process and what's useful. I do find that, you know, writing things, even if I feel like they're not good, is important, because later they'll turn out to be fine, or later you can edit them and they end up being fine. I do think trying to compose the perfect thing on the first try can become a real obstacle to writing anything at all.
Yes, and just to be clear, I'm not saying don't write regularly, nor am I saying wait to write until everything's perfect. All I'm emphasizing to you is if these techniques don't feel right to you, don't spend too much time worrying about doing things differently. The point is just to commit time and energy to writing, however that works for you.
Yeah. I think another important point for a lot of people, I talked about deleting a paragraph being a good day of writing for me sometimes. Sometimes you'll write something and later the question shifts, or later you'll just realize that's not the direction you need to go at that place. And it can be really hard to delete things that you've written, especially if they're good, right? I have a whole computer, like a file on my hard drive of clever stuff I've written that's never made it into any publications, but I can't quite delete it because like I'm so proud of it just in my own mind. Like I'm really tickled with myself that I thought of that clever way of putting something where I really thought that was a smart point, even though related to what has never yet been determined. Where to begin? And here I mean the process of like writing up a B.Phil thesis. And again, this is a suggested, actual experience may vary, but typically what we recommend to people is you try and write a very rough cut of the introduction, then try to write up the argument, right? Which will often take a couple of drafts. Those are the chapters. Those are the things you're going to share with the advisor along the way. Then you write the conclusion, then you rewrite the argument, then you rewrite the conclusion, then the last thing you write, pretty much everyone agrees, is the introduction, right? The introduction is usually, in 90% of cases at least, I would say, people I know in their writing process, the introduction comes last, right? Because the introduction, you don't know what you're introducing until the rest of it is done. So a big problem that a lot of people have is they try and get the introduction perfect before moving on. And that's a recipe for getting frustrated because often you don't know how to introduce the thing because you haven't written it yet. You haven't solved it all. So if writing is part of the process of discovering the argument, as we said, then it makes sense why the introduction would kind of come last. Again, like you don't have to write the chapters in the right order. You'll bounce around. Some will get done sooner than others. Like this is not you must follow this process. It's just to say that, a first draft of the introduction helps you get a sense of what you're trying to say. You'll work out the argument and then you'll revise and refine, right? So it's iterative is the point, and you're going to be moving back and forth all the time. And mainly it's a psychological struggle, I find at least. The hardest thing for me about writing is to keep at it. And like I said, at this point, I think I could safely say I've published enough that anyone would say, oh, he's published a lot. And it doesn't like get easier in a way to solve some of those. I don't know what I'm talking about. People are going to think I'm a fraud. This is so painful. Why can't I say what I'm trying to say? I say that not to scare you off, just to say that like all those things are things you may experience and they shouldn't put you off from writing because you can be a successful writer and still experience all that stuff, right? The trick is to, be prepared for that and say, oh yeah, I remember he warned us at the end of that long multi-hour research toolkit thing back in whenever, they warned us. It's going to be hard sometimes, right? So consider yourselves warned. It's going to be a struggle, but like I said, it can be a really wonderful, rewarding, exhilarating experience to write something, especially something that's the product of a lot of time and energy invested into research. So it's hard, but worth it, I would say. I'm going to skip the discussion for now just because I want to get to these last couple of points, and then we'll have a moment at the end for everyone to discuss. We've already seen this slide, but I want to just mention that when we talk about methods, really what we're talking about is ways that we come to acquire knowledge of the world, right? So this can be everything from test tubes and chemicals to interviews to looking through archives to singing with people, like whatever it might be. there's a million ways to create and acquire knowledge about the world. And the methods that you're going to use are going to be, again, related to your questions and your data. Methods vary a lot because different disciplines tend to ask different kinds of questions. And it is a requirement for BPhil students that they take a methods course in their fields. So we do want you to have some sense of what the methods that you use in your field look like, because we can't, teach you about all the different methods of all the different disciplines. That would be impossible.
And at the same time, global studies emphasizes interdisciplinarity. So what that means is that on the one hand, we want you to be trained in your specific discipline's methods. And on the other hand, when you come into my capstone seminar, I'm going to blow that all up because I'm going to tell you, okay, now what if we expand your methodology so that it is interdisciplinary, because it will contribute to the ways that you're trying to ask these questions.
Right. And so global studies, I've skipped ahead a slide here, is really interdisciplinary, as Kat said, or transdisciplinary, because we're focused on connection and we tend to borrow our methods from all over the place. So we'll push you hard to think about other ways you might ask your question or similar questions, or other ways you might try to answer the question that you've asked. That being said, in a funny kind of way, it's important to have some foundation that we can destabilize, if that makes sense. I think the university is not yet equipped for genuinely transdisciplinary education, and so we want to try and make sure you have a foot in things. But it's also just to say, whatever your field, you can do a global studies project, right? That's one of the great things about it. There's no disciplines that are really excluded. Pretty much anyone can approach something from a global studies perspective. So I had a little slide here. I won't spend time on it now again, because I'm aware that people need to go, but you can just think about a topic, a broad topic like inequality, right? That's a topic, not a question. But think about how various disciplines might think about it. So politics, economics, anthropology, literature, philosophy, history, all might think about a topic like inequality, and all would use different sources of data, different types of data to think about that question. So again, in a world where we were more on time, we'd have had you work through this a little bit as an example, but it's just meant to point to the many ways in which topics can be addressed from many different angles, and then which is why, of course, the sort of transdisciplinary quality of global studies is particularly attractive, right? Because you might bring a bunch of those together to answer a specific question in a way that's really original and exciting. At the end, but not unimportant, methods and ethics go closely together. All research that we do involves ethical questions. Obviously, there's plagiarism, bad, right? Don't plagiarize. Everybody knows this. And yet, if you have any questions about what plagiarism is, talk to any of us or go to the English department, has a great website explaining plagiarism. But there's also honesty or research integrity. And that's both in the collection and preservation of data and in its analysis and interpretation. So, if you're an anthropologist doing interviews, you need to collect and store and preserve that data in ways that make sure that it's accurate, in ways that protect the anonymity of the people you've spoken with, if that's an important part of the project that you're doing. You need to have your field notes organized in a way that you could reconstruct them and share them with others so that they might be able to see how you reached the conclusions that you reached. And then also, as we've already discussed, in the data analysis and interpretation, right? You can't fudge it. You can't ignore the evidence that doesn't point in the direction that you want it to point, and so on and so forth. And so it's always important to have honesty or integrity in your research, both in the data collection and also in the data analysis.
That includes recognizing, which is something, once again, that I teach in the capstone, recognizing your own biases and the fact that we all come to different conclusions looking at the same data because of who we are. And so being aware of how those biases play into the way you interpret things.
Right, and you know, again, we'd be happy to talk a lot more with you about this. And I know that the Office of Undergraduate Research offers a couple of workshops on research methods and integrity and so on. But there's one thing that we do want to talk about because it's tripped up innumerable BPhil students in the past. Certain kinds of methods require special attention, and those are research with human subjects. And so there's something called the IRB, the Institutional Review Board, that oversees all research that involves human subjects. There's also guidelines for animal subjects. Typically, those aren't relevant for global studies, so I'm not going to go into them here. But if you're doing any research that involves animal subjects, make sure you learn about those guidelines as well. But for guideline that involves human subjects, the rule is that any research has to be cleared before the research gets conducted. So if you're going to interview people, do surveys, subject people to experiments or treatments of any kind, you need to get clearance before you do the research, right? Otherwise, you literally, well, first of all, could get in legal trouble depending on the nature of the research if it involves experiments or treatments. But also your research won't count, right? Literally, Pitt will not accept it. If your BPhil thesis is based on a bunch of interviews that you didn't have permission to do, you're not going to get the BPhil.
And I want to add, just because interview makes it sound very formal, interview means literally any kind of talking to a human being. Even if you then don't write down what they said or directly use it in your work, if you are talking to people in order to do your research, you need to go through IRB.
Right, and so there is a process that you go through. Here's another thing that trips people up. Most social science and humanities research falls into a category that the IRB confusingly calls exempt. Right, so what that means is you submit the outline of the research you're going to do, and they'll give you a finding that says, yeah, this research is exempt. You don't need to do further protocols. But just to get the exemption, you have to go through the process, right? You can't look at that and conclude, oh, I'm going to be exempt, and so therefore I don't have to do it, right? It's a poor choice of words, I think, on the IRB's part, because it's not exempt from the process. It's exempt from the further requirements that certain kinds of research triggers. So you have to answer questions like, how will I protect the anonymity of the subjects? Will the questions that I'm asking put people in any danger? All these kinds of things, right? And you have to go through that clearance beforehand. So the thing that happens most frequently is that people convince themselves that this doesn't apply to them. And then afterwards, we realize we have a problem. So if you are going to even think about other people, you should ask your advisor, do I need to go through the IRB process here just to make sure, right? Because again, once you've done it, there's no undoing it. And if you've done it badly, it can derail your entire project.
And also, if your chosen mentor has never worked with human subjects before, they may tell you that you don't have to go through the process, and they may be wrong. This happened to me on my dissertation. My advisor only worked with literature. She was sure that I did not have to apply, and it would have been problematic if I had not had other people pushing me to check carefully. So more than just asking your mentor, ask your mentor and then maybe ask 2 other people as well.
So I know people are having to leave. I should have thrown this up earlier. Just in case, Elaine asked me to post this QR code if anyone needs it for the suitable whatever thingy, you can grab a picture of this. We've now covered all the things that we wanted to cover. Again, I realize it's a lot. And we've experimented in the past with breaking this up into several different workshops, but then it's hard for people to attend across multiple different sessions and whatever. So we kind of try and plow through it, but we hope at least this has introduced you to the process enough that you'll be able to come back to us knowing what questions you want to ask or knowing what additional things you need. We're happy to take some more questions now, I think, but that concludes the formal presentation. So thanks so much for your attention. And yeah, if anyone has any more questions, let's have them. But again, if also what you need is to like run outside and get some fresh air because that was a lot.
And the sun's kind of out right now.
Yeah, if you want to write back to us later, please feel free to reach out. I know either of us would be happy to answer any.
And all of our contact information can be found on the Global Studies website.